So my name is Jason Kauffman. I'm the Stormwater Coordinator for the City of Goshen. I've been doing this since April of 2014. And my role as a Stormwater Coordinator for the City of Goshen is to manage the day-to-day aspects of the program. And the stormwater program that we have comes out of part of the Clean Water Act. And so the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, Phase 2, which was put in place back in early 2000s, requires that we do certain things, and there's 6 minimum control measures that we have to implement as part of our program. And those are public education and involvement, outreach to the public, construction site, erosion sediment control, post-construction, stormwater control on those construction sites. For long-term, there's illicit discharge detection and elimination, and then there's also municipal good housekeeping, pollution prevention good housekeeping at our own municipal facilities. So those 6 minimum control measures are what I'm managing in some fashion each day, whether it's dealing with public education, meeting with students or adults in public settings, responding to illicit discharges where something was poured down the storm drain or dumped in the storm into a waterway that wasn't supposed to be there, or dealing with erosion sediment control issues on construction sites. Also, our own facilities, we have to manage those to make sure that we're not generating pollutants from those sites that are impacting our waterways. So those are the things that I do daily. And the thing I enjoy about that is that it is different every day. I come in with a plan in the morning, and I go home in the afternoon, sometimes having completed what I thought, or sometimes dealing with something that completely was not known at the start of the day. So yeah, it's very different and can change from day to day. The way that fits in with our stormwater system in Goshen, we have historically our system back before 1934. Our system, everything was combined. Everything went to the river. In 1934, we installed our first wastewater treatment plant, which was able to treat everything that flowed to that system, both sanitary sewage and stormwater, until about the 1970s when when Goshen got too large and the system no longer could handle the flow coming there, and so we had to put in what are called release pipes or release points, and those were our outfall pipes that have now come to be known as combined sewer overflows. So then in the mid 80s to 90s, early 90s, we realized, and CSOs are an issue that along the East Coast, Great Lakes, and throughout the country, I mean, a lot of places had CSOs. But we came to realize the impact that was having, because you're having raw sewage discharged into the river. So we've been working, Goshen along with numerous communities have worked to remove all the combined sewer overflows. And Goshen was able to do that in the 2000s, early 2000s. We were able to get everything removed through the installation of a wet weather detention facility that can hold up to 5 million gallons of combined sewage and stormwater. And then we also have another system of pipes that are over 1.5 miles long that can hold another 1 million gallons. So we can hold 6 million gallons there, and our wastewater treatment plant can treat, if that facility fills up, it can treat it down and can treat all that 6 million gallons in 72 hours. So we're able to manage that. And since that time, and we've started to, we removed the combined sewer overflow pipes, but we started to separate storm from combined. But since the 90s, we've realized that stormwater itself carries pollutants. Anything that the water picks up is transported now directly to a waterway, and most of the times it's untreated. And so that's where stormwater, coordinating stormwater and managing our stormwater in our city is a big deal, because all that pollutants that had been being treated by the wastewater treatment plant now go directly to the river or to some other waterway. So the pollutants that we run into, a big one is sediment from construction sites and just from the erosion, natural erosion from yards and other places. From that's a big deal. You can definitely tell sediment is an issue after a heavy rainstorm. The Elkhart River turns brown and it's full of sediment. You also have any oils or brake dust or other materials that come off of vehicles that are traveling on the roads. Then you also have salt. That is a big deal. That comes from winter application for safety. And so you have the release of salt not only in the wintertime but and the springtime, but also into the summer as it gets washed out of the ground, out of the vegetation and into our waterways. There is bacteria. You have natural sources, which are geese, which we have a lot of issues with along our waterways and ponds, especially when people mow their grass directly down to the water's edge. You have a lot of geese, but then you also have dogs. One thing we encourage people to do is to pick up after their pets, because that what's left is a source of bacteria, and if it's not picked up, it can run off. And then finally, another big issue is trash. You just walk down any street and you're going to be able to see, most likely you'll see trash within a few feet. It's unfortunate, but that is something that is an issue as well. So in trying to deal with that, the fact that we've now separated our systems so that the stormwater is going directly to our waterways untreated, we have now started to put in what are called stormwater treatment units. And these units will take out three things. They'll take out sediment that can settle to the bottom. It'll capture oil because it floats on top of water. And then it also is designed to catch some of the trash that is being washed down our pipes and into our waterways. Unfortunately, it doesn't catch everything. There are some materials that don't float on top of the water. They're called neutral buoyant. So they get mixed in with the water column and can get sucked out. So those types of things are plastic bags, cigarette butts, straws, things that float but can also sink to a certain extent when it gets mixed in with the water. But we are able to treat out some of the pollutants. We also have catch basins that are part of our stormwater system, and they're sumps underneath the pipe. And what that does is it captures the heavier materials. So a lot of the sediment, some trash gets caught in there, and so that is then cleaned out by our water and sewer department. They come in with their Vector trucks in the spring and throughout the year, and they remove that material, especially also the sand that's put down from winter application for road safety. And so they are treating that out, not treating it out, but removing that so that it is not getting to our waterways. We also have street sweepers that are running through town at least twice a year. Downtown gets swept monthly, every Thursday and Friday, right before First Friday events. The street sweepers come through, and so they're trying to sweep up both. So it's usually 2 times in the year. It's springtime to sweep up the sand and residue that's left over from winter, but then also in the fall to sweep up any leaves or other materials that may have accumulated over the summertime. So those are the things that we're doing to keep pollutants out of our stormwater system. There's still a lot that can be done, but we understand now what impact we're having, and that the pollutants that get picked up by stormwater runoff is a big deal. When February, would have been the week before when we had that. Leading up to it, we had about 12, at least a foot of snow on the ground, and that Thursday before, we had around an inch of rain. So we knew our system was already reaching a point of the ground was still frozen. It was still waterlogged, and so I was already looking ahead, trying to figure out what kind of impact this might have, because the snow that was on the ground, at least foot of snow, had 1 3/4 1.75 inches of water in the snowpack, and so we knew when and if the snow melted, we'd have 1.75 inches of water moving through our system. So when we realized with the rain that was coming that it was going to be a large amount of rain, we didn't know how much it was going to be, but they were forecasting anywhere from 3 to 5 inches, and so we knew that there was going to be an issue. We didn't know how big of an issue it was going to be. So when the rain started coming that Monday, I was out doing kind of some inspections of areas that we knew had drainage issues, so that we could kind of keep an eye on those areas and start to evaluate whether or not there was going to be an issue. And also during that time, we were looking at the National Weather Service. They have a website where there's a hydrograph from the United States Geological Survey river gauge, which is located on Indiana Bridge at the Elkhart River. And so we were watching that graph, the hydrograph, to kind of figure out what the forecasted level for the height of the river was going to be. So one of the things that surprised us about that was that it kept changing. At the time we knew the river was going to reach at least 9 to 9.5 feet, and we knew that would put Chicago Avenue underwater, Rogers Park and Chicago Avenue underwater. What happened was over that day and into the evening and into Tuesday morning, the forecasted height for the river kept rising, and so we weren't quite sure how high the river was going to go. So the next day, as we came into Tuesday, Monday afternoon, we were looking at areas that we knew were going to have issues with drainage, and we were finding those areas to have a lot of water. Olive Street is a good example. There's a lot of water that flows down Olive Street, and what we realized there was that our stormwater, the inlets into our stormwater system, were being covered by leaves and some trash, and that was reducing the amount of water that could go into the system and causing the water to then run south down Olive Street, which was causing high water and safety concerns. We also found some other areas that where water was flowing, that Southwest Goshen has an issue with drainage. And so we were keeping an eye on that area. And we found some other areas that didn't realize that water flowed so much through as it did that day. So we were investigating those areas. So Tuesday morning comes, and from Monday through Thursday, I was in my vehicle driving around and doing investigations because what my role was at that point was to provide on-the-ground information to the decision makers so they could decide what needed to be done, whether a street needed to be closed. I was one of several people that were doing that, but what we were trying to do is identify areas that were impacted, that needed to be from road closures to just knowing where the water was at. So Tuesday we were out doing that, but it came, and Tuesday was where Chicago Avenue went underwater, Tuesday afternoon. So when we went home that day, we knew the floodwaters were still rising. What really surprised me, and I think some others, was the fact that by Wednesday morning, Plymouth Avenue, Lincoln Avenue, and Pike Street were all underwater. Pike Street was still somewhat passable. It probably shouldn't have been passable, but it was still passable, and that basically cut Goshen in half. There was only two ways now to get across from west to east side, and that was either Kircher or Wilden. And over the day on Wednesday, which created a lot of problems for getting to work, and ended up closing schools and some businesses. But as that day went on and the rains ended and the waters continued to rise, we lost Chicago Avenue and Indiana Avenue by the old bag factory. That went underwater. And that also, we were watching that all day as well, because as the waters rise, we have an access. It's called I believe this will be right, but an anti-siphon to our sanitary system. And if that would have gone underwater, our sanitary system would have failed to a certain extent, and we couldn't have treated the waste as we were.
How close did that get?
It was touching the concrete around the grates that opened, so it was probably within 4 inches of that structure to entering into that siphon. So wastewater employees went out and actually sandbagged and covered those areas as much as possible to give us as much additional protection as we could, because at that point we were anticipating, as the day went on, we were looking at potentially 12.9 for a crest, and that would have put that underwater. So as the day went on, Wilden Avenue and Indiana Avenue, which had been the north portion of that had been closed because of the Rock Run Creek flooding out the mobile home park there, that started to go underwater. And by 5:30 that evening, water was in that intersection. It was not covering the intersection on Wilden, but Indiana Avenue was underwater to a certain extent. It was still passable, but again, if the water continued to rise, we could have lost that access as well. So we were out doing inspections that day, just trying to give real-time information to the decision makers. This storm and how it fits in with what we've designed for, they are calling this at least a 500-year rain event. And that means that there's a 2% chance that it would happen every year. You have 100-year events and 500-year events. They talk about that, and that has been in the news quite a bit here. And those types of events are 100-year and 500-year is a little misleading, because it doesn't mean that it's going to happen once in 100 years. It means that if it's a 100-year event, it's 1% chance a year, and if it's a 500-year event, the opportunity for it to happen is a 0.2% chance per year. So you have places like Texas that have had a 500-year event 3 years in a row. So that's an important thing for people to understand, is that there's always a chance that these events could happen in a given year. And from so this event is being classified as a 500-year rain event, or a 0.2% chance event, and it's very difficult to manage or to plan or manage this type of event, because the amount of land and infrastructure that would need to be put in place to manage the amount of water that was coming through is impractical. It would be very expensive, and there would be a lot of, you'd have to use a lot more land than what we have, than what the public would probably be willing to put aside. So yes, our system worked as it was designed up to the point where it was overwhelmed by just the volume of water. Our retention basins that we have in place worked and were able to function correctly. We had our pipes, our stormwater system, the pipes and everything were able to handle the water. Now, if you were out where there was a lot of water flowing through, you probably saw bathtub, like a swirl around a number of catch basins, because just the amount of water that was coming was enough that it had to. It was very interesting to see, and And so in those cases, if we had trash or other pollutants or even leaves and such that got caught on top of the catch basins, they created a flooding issue because the water couldn't get into the basins. So that the systems themselves may have worked just fine, but if they got covered and the water couldn't flow into it, that created some issues. And as we found those, we were able to go out and address those situations. We have the riparian cooridor along the Elkhart River that is still in existence. We have some wetlands around that are there that act as natural buffers for flooding events. Unfortunately, over time, over 85% of our wetlands, not just in Goshen, but throughout our nation, have been lost to development or other uses. They've been drained, and so we've lost a lot of our wetlands, and some of our floodplains as well. And so part of what we realized through this event is that, just again, we were reminded how important our floodplains and wetlands are, and through the preservation of what floodplains we have in Goshen, by the use of locating parks in them and encouraging people not to develop in those areas. People over time have developed in some of the floodplain areas, and we could see that with the flooding that happened. Now, there were areas that flooded that were outside of our floodplain maps, but before we understood the impact of how we develop, areas were developed, and so those floodplains were lost, or at least changed. And so now we're having to deal with the results of that, but also having to create new floodplains or create new wetland areas. A good example of that is the two-stage ditch that we have down in Horn Ditch. It's in the industrial area on the southeast side of Goshen. It goes from County Road 31 to College Avenue, which is County Road 36. And so an example here is that back in 2006, we had a fairly large rain event that caused some significant flooding in that area. And there was around $22 million worth of public and private property damage that occurred. And from that event, the City of Goshen, the Elkhart County surveyor, and those businesses that were affected worked together to build and put in place this two-stage ditch, which you could call a man-made floodplain, because what happened was the ditch itself was left intact, but we pushed back the banks about 40 feet on either side, so you have an 80-foot wide floodplain that was created. So earlier you had asked what impressed us about this flooding, or what surprised us, and what impressed us was the fact that this two-stage ditch worked. The water filled up nearly to the top, but it didn't go outside of it. So all those businesses that were impacted back in 2006 were spared any impact this time. So the fact that that happened showed us that doing that is helpful. And so that's an example of a floodplain that we created. Now, the floodplains that we have still in existence that our parks are in, so Rogers Park, Shanklin, those Oak Ridge, those flooded, and the reason that they are parks is because they're floodplains. And so the brunt of the damage that occurred in those areas is now having to be repaired. We have structures in Shanklin that were damaged. We have a lot of sediment and sand that has to be removed. Abshire, the pedestrian path in Abshire Prairie, there's 0.3 of a mile there that was damaged and will have to be repaired in some way. And in some of those areas, so again, going back to your question about what impressed us or what surprised us, the amount of material that was left over after the waters receded was quite impressive. Along Abshire Prairie, there were some areas where the sediment that was deposited was over a foot deep. And then again, that 3/10 of a mile, there was material deposited over that entire length of the path, and so that has to be removed. Fiddler Pond was closed for several weeks and was just repaired last week because of the damage that happened to the path there, and we had 3.5 feet deep gullies cut through the path there that had to be repaired. The river going through Shanklin Park jumped the bank and basically cut through Diamond 2 and washed parts of the diamond away and deposited it again a foot or more thick on the roadway that goes through Shanklin. So the floodplains are important. I mean, they serve their purpose and they kept the water from going other places, because what happens when we develop in the floodplains, especially when you're reducing the amount of area that water can soak into, you're pushing that water somewhere else. And so as we develop, that water has to go somewhere. And if we don't account for that, we don't plan for where that water is going to go, or how we're going to slow it, how we're going to allow it to soak into the ground or slow it down as it goes to the river or to a waterway, it's going to cause a problem, whether it be in flooding or damage to infrastructure. And we saw some of that, but thankfully we didn't see, outside of the floodplains, we didn't see a lot of infrastructure damage. Yeah, I mean, as you develop. So this morning, what I did was there's a graphic that we have that kind of shows what happens with runoff when an area is developed, and so as you increase the amount of hard surface in an area, you get more runoff. So and whether, I don't think I can quantify what the depth would have been, but if you are, so we had 5 inches of rain in those 2 days, and I mean, that 5 inches of rain has to go somewhere. So if it's not soaking in the ground, it's going to run off. So depending on how large of an area is, how large of a watershed that water is running across, how much land that's running across to a single point, I mean, that's going to add up over time. And so the more hard surface we have, the more water is going to go to the river, and that's going to have to go somewhere. And so in the conversations that we had during the flooding event, we talked about, when is the river going to crest? And really that cresting is just the wave of water, the volume of water moving through our city. And so you can kind of just, you know what a wave looks like at the ocean or a lake shore. It's kind of just a wave of water moving through our city. And if it doesn't have, and if it's not soaking into the ground, it's going to join, all that water that's not soaking into the ground is going to join that wave of water and move through. So it would have been higher if we had more hard surface in the floodplain. It would have been higher. How much higher is hard to say. So the areas upstream of Goshen that may have had an impact on the water coming through, it's really hard to say. We're not really sure what type of impact that might have had, or I really don't want to speculate on that. But the fact that if you were at the dam during the event, the amount of water coming over top of the dam was quite a bit. I mean, it was higher. The dam helps to control the water level upstream. It was higher, but how much flooding happened upstream, we don't really know. We haven't heard any reports of that, so it's kind of hard to say what impact it might have had, or what impact it did have on Goshen. Correct. No, it doesn't. And the question that was asked at one point was, could we put more water into the mill race to kind of help divert water, because the mill race stayed at the same height the entire event. Unfortunately, putting any additional water into the mill race could cause the mill race to fail, the levees to fail, because again, those were constructed 150 years ago. When those were constructed, it was done with horses and plows behind them. It wasn't the standards back then were much different than what they are now, and I mean they did what they could with the technology they had, but the levees are such that if we put too much water pressure behind them, the opportunity is there that they could fail. So we couldn't put any more water into the mill race, so it was just going over the dam and spreading out in the areas that we've preserved. I mean, there's from the dam to the south or to the north end of Shanklin is mostly our floodplains are forested and Shanklin Park. Other than that, once you get up to, it would be close to Lincoln, where Linway Plaza is. That's where you start to get the development, and that's where a lot of places were impacted. So part of the flood impacted Goshen primarily on the west side of the river, from Indiana Avenue to the river, and then from Lincoln to Pike. That was the area that was impacted, and also then from South Indiana, from Berkey up to Lincoln, that area was also flooded because the floodplain comes through Mollett Park and covers Indiana. So those were the areas that were impacted by the floodwaters, and you did get some areas up off of Wilden too, close to Rock Run Creek. And the Elkhart River and Rock Run Creek are the two primary waterways that flow through Goshen and that have floodplains. Unfortunately, after the fact, after the event, we discovered a report that was done back in 2013 by the USGS that forecasted a floodplain, or forecasted areas that would be inundated by floodwaters from 13 feet all the way down to, I think it was 7. And when we found that, we looked at it, and it was it was fairly accurate. The areas that were underwater were shown on that map to be underwater, and so that was something that was kind of interesting to see. I mean, we now know what would happen if we ever had a flood event that was greater than this one. If we ever had one that reached 13 feet, we know what areas would be impacted outside of what was already impacted. And the issue that we're running into are those other waterways that don't have mapped floodplains per se, and the areas that flooded earlier on during the event. So Southwest Goshen, we have a lot of water flowing through there. We have a subdivision there called the Crossing, and then you have Fairhaven and Goshen Birthing Center. And so much water comes through there that the parking lot for Fairhaven and Goshen Birthing Center actually went underwater. And so for them to continue to operate, they lost all their parking. So Lighthouse Lane became the parking lot, and was very difficult to come through. And Goshen is working to address that drainage issue with the property owners there of the Crossing and Goshen Birthing Center in Fairhaven, because it's not the first time that that's happened, and we know that that's an issue. So we're working towards a solution to that, to help provide additional detention time to slow the water down, because that's what's important is having a place for the water to go, but then also slowing it down and allowing it to release at a rate that So yeah, those areas that are not mapped, those are areas that are kind of unknown until it happens. And then, so after the fact, now that we've gone through this event that was the worst in our history, we now are trying to prepare for the next time. We hope the next time doesn't come for a long time, but we know that it will at some point. And so what we're trying to do now is prepare and say, okay, at this time or at this water height, we know that these areas are impacted. So that USGS study that we found is very helpful. But we also now have real world experience after going through this event, and we can say hopefully we'll be able to come up with a flood elevation where we know that that Lincoln will go underwater, or that Plymouth will go underwater, or that the residential areas that were impacted need to be evacuated. Those types of things are what we're looking for, so that if those events come again, we'll be prepared. So the fact that that we live in a world that everybody has a phone or a video camera in their pocket, or camera or a video that can take pictures or video just by pulling out their phone. I mean, that's huge. The floods that we've had in the past, we've had a few pictures or a few videos, but this time there were quite a few. There's a lot of documentation that we can now pull from, and we can only see so much. But the fact that citizens were out there also taking pictures or using their drones to take video and is very helpful. So I wasn't surprised by it because I expected it. But what I am surprised, or what I appreciate, is the fact that now we have so much information to pull from. My brother's a teacher, and school was closed for 2 days because of the flood, and so he has a drone. So I was able to go out. He was able to come out with me, and we were able to go to those areas that we knew were being impacted and take and get the videos and pictures that we needed to be able to document what was going on. But we also saw other people out there with drones. It was kind of interesting to be standing there and then to see a drone fly over, or to hear it, knowing that yours is up there too. And so that was, it was helpful to have all that information, to have all those pictures, and to not only that, but then you can also, people are more aware of what's going on. Facebook was a good source for people to share videos and photos, and then get information out to people. None of our systems are designed to handle the amount of water that came through, but they did function as designed, and as they should have. And the ground was frozen at the beginning of the event, but by the end it had thawed, and it was waterlogged, but it was still working. So the infrastructure that we have in place, as far as we know, worked very well, and we don't believe any of it was damaged. As far as we can tell so far, things were in good shape. The things that potentially have received damage that we'll find over time would be any pipe outfalls. It's possible that the measures that were put in place to protect those from scour erosion or from eroding away may have been impacted by the amount of water flowing past them, or amount of water flowing out of them. But they're designed to handle the water, and they are. So if those were damaged, we'll find those over time as we go out and take a look at them. But overall, as far as we know, the system functioned correctly and is still in good shape. The thing that we did notice, again, because there's so much water, is that the groundwater has come up. So there are basins out there, whether it be private or public, that now have groundwater sitting in them because the groundwater levels are so high. So the capacity, if we would have another rain event, the capacity that they are supposed to hold is not there. It's been reduced, and it will stay that way until the groundwater goes back down. And groundwater fluctuates, and so when we design these systems, we design them as dry bottom anyways. So they're supposed to be above groundwater level, and usually that works pretty well. But sometimes, like in this event, groundwater comes up higher than it was anticipated, and so now you have basins that are impacted. And that's one thing that we're going to be dealing with over time is talking with, if it's on a private property where they're required to hold so much, that we may have to go back to them and say, and have conversations about whether or not they have the capacity that's required. Because if they don't, if currently what we require is that a development holds 3 inches of water in 24 hours. So it's a 1 hour, 100-year rain event. And if they can't hold that amount of water anymore, then we'll have to have a conversation with them about what changes need to be made. If they have to enlarge their system so that it holds the water, or sometimes what happens, it may be groundwater, but other times the basins themselves have become sealed because of the sediment that's settled in the bottom, and so now they have to be cleaned out. And that's one of those things from a post-construction standpoint that we manage, that we make sure that these measures that were put in place to manage stormwater, that those measures are operating correctly. So whether the water is soaking into the ground, or whether the pollutants are being allowed to settle, or having a chance to settle out, that's what these measures are there for, so that they reduce the amount of pollutants going to our waterways. So the basins that are out there now, and the sizes that they are done for a specific reason, and that's to hold that runoff that would have soaked into the ground before it was developed, and now is having to go somewhere. Those basins and the size that they are, as far as we know, most of those worked as designed and didn't overflow. We have the soils in Goshen and in parts of Elkhart County are very well drained, are very good for drainage, and so we have a lot of true retention basins where the water comes into the basin, and the only way that it goes out is either by soaking into the ground or evaporation. We have a few areas where the soils are more heavy and require detention basins, where the water comes in and then over time is released at a slower rate, so that it can, in that case, it's slowing the water down but still releasing it to our storm system that eventually gets to the river. So in the instance of several basins that have a controlled release, those worked. They didn't overtop, and which was we were happy to see, because they were put in place to alleviate drainage issues around those areas, and those function correctly. In the case of Southwest Goshen, where the crossing and Fairhaven are located, that one did overtop, and it was just the amount of water flowing through there, and having to go somewhere. And so we have two basins right next to each other that currently are divided, and one basin, the water level was much lower than the other one. And so the intent that we have to address that drainage problem there, is to combine those two basins and make a larger basin, and then to have a controlled release under Plymouth Avenue. So that's what we're working towards. But overall, thinking back over the event and the areas in town that were impacted, most of the basins that we have in place worked. So Century Drive is one industrial area that where the two-stage ditch is, that was impacted back in 2006, and so this time it was fared any issues. We do have, again, as the development of that industrial area has taken place, we used to have water that came across Century Drive, and a development came in and captured that water and redirected it through a number of detention basins out to Horn Ditch. And so that there was no flooding in this case. So that helped with that. The Goshen Industrial Park along Eisenhower Drive, close to Greencroft and such, to be honest, I'm not sure how that fared. But to my knowledge, we didn't have any issues in that area. So things worked to a certain extent. But my knowledge on that area is limited at this point. So what are we planning to do for when this type of event happens again? We are still working through that, but several of the things that we are looking at is whether or not we have to change our stormwater drainage policy. So again, 3 inches in 24 hours is what we require currently. The question is do we have to increase that? And if we have to increase that, what is the amount that will help our community, but at the same time not be prohibitive to development. So we're trying to come up. So that's something that we'll have to look at. We also have to look at whether or not the sizing of our stormwater pipes is adequate, and whether or not we're going to have to increase that. Those are two things that we would have to look at from a system standpoint, and whether or not it will function correctly. The other thing that we're looking at and would encourage people to consider is how they can slow the water down, whether it be at your own house or whether it be at your business. The use of what is called green infrastructure is something that's going to become a much bigger topic of discussion. And green infrastructure is anything from a rain barrel to a rain garden or a bioretention area, depending if you're residential or commercial, bioswales, and pervious pavement that's going to allow the water to soak into the ground. You can also have green roofs or even trees. The planting of trees is huge. I mean, the impact that one tree has on the amount of stormwater that it can take up is quite a bit. And so our trees, I can't speak highly enough about trees and the fact that the impact or the reduction in stormwater runoff that they provide. All you have to do is stand underneath a tree in a rainstorm, and you know how much water is actually getting captured, because you don't get as wet as you would if you were not standing underneath the tree. So encouraging people to use methods to slow the water down is going to be another way that we work towards preparing for and mitigating any future events that we might have. So the other things that we could consider that other cities or other communities are doing, that's a good question, and it's one that I'm not sure exactly how to answer either. Sure. But I know that going back to permeable pavement, a lot of communities are looking at green streets as a way to slow water down, and that's through a number of different things that can be done: permeable pavement, rain gardens, trees, those types of things. So looking at ways that we can just incorporate into our existing system different measures of how to slow the water down. In the past, getting water out of an area was important and was the key thing that went into decision making. But now we're understanding the impact of stormwater runoff and the benefit of slowing it down and allowing it to soak into the ground. And so other steps that we could take, there are other things that we can do out there. It just comes down whether or not they can be implemented in our community or any community. It comes down to to funding and space. And those are the big issues that usually come to the forefront of any discussion on what to do with stormwater, because you need to have the funding there to be able to do it, but you also need space, because it does require space. Instead of instead of just a curb and a gutter that can fit underneath an existing road or sidewalk, sometimes you need to remove some of those areas or to expand the area, and that does require additional space sometimes. One thing that we really want people to understand and recognize is that we do have a USGS river gauge in Goshen, and that without that gauge, we'd be the only thing that we could do would be react. The fact that we had that gauge allowed us to kind of prepare for what the impact was going to be. I mean, it kept changing as time went on, and that was one thing that we learned, was that we can't put all of our trust in what that river gauge is saying, because it's a prediction. But it does allow us to have an idea of what's coming, how much water is going to be flowing through Goshen. And over time, funding for river gauges has decreased. And so the fact that we still have one, and it's been in place, I'd like to say since sometime in the early 1930s, I believe. The fact that we still have that and have all that historical data is very important. And if we would lose that gauge, our ability to respond would be impacted. And part of our discussions have been, are there other ways that we could find funding to put additional gauges in, so that we have a better understanding of how much water is flowing through our system? Because some areas had historic flooding in Goshen, other areas on other waterways on the periphery of our community actually were not as impacted by this flood as they have been in previous floods in the past decade. So having the river gauge is very important, and if we would lose that, that would be a huge blow to our ability to respond. Making sure that people know what kind of resources are out there for their own knowledge, if they want to know what is going on. So the National Weather Service has an excellent website where we get the hydrograph from the river gauge, and that's something that's important to have, to let people know about. And going back to what happens when we develop an area, and the fact that water can't soak into the ground, water is going to go somewhere, and either we can decide where it's going to go, or help guide it to where we want it to go. That's important, because if we don't plan for where the water is going to go, we're going to have flooding in areas that we aren't ready for, and that's going to impact people both from a standpoint of losing access to their homes, but also to property damage and possibly losing their homes. And so that's important. So again, going back to the fact that we just need to, the important things that we look at from a stormwater standpoint is slowing it down. If we can slow it down and reduce the rate at which it's coming to our rivers and local waterways, that's going to reduce flooding. So just planning for that, whether it is installing a rain barrel or a rain garden at your house, or thinking of ways that you can allow the water to soak into the ground at your business. I mean, those are important things to consider when developing or looking at ways to change your property. Along those lines, there's a tool that we have linked on the Stormwater website. It's called Rain Ready, and it allows a resident to figure out what kind of flooding could impact their house. It requires some information that's readily available for most people to find, and it will give them an idea of what type of flooding they could anticipate. So if people live outside of an area that was flooded in this last event, they may be worried about what kind of event would it take to impact them, and this tool allows them to kind of explore that a little bit and to look into ways that they could reduce flooding at their house. Another thing, I guess, would be just to say that stormwater pollution is a big thing that we're looking at now. A lot of the Clean Water Act always, when it was first put in place, looked at point source pollutions, where you could point at a pipe or point at a discharge and say that's where it's coming from. Now we look at non-point source pollution, where we can't really identify a source. And stormwater runoff is a huge non-point source pollutant, and because it picks up everything water picks up anything that it flows across. And so the fact that what we do every day has an impact somewhere. So if you see trash on the ground, picking it up and making sure it's thrown in a trash can is huge. Making sure that your trash is covered so that it doesn't get dispersed in the wind or by animals is key, because even if it's on the ground here, it could end up in our river system and eventually make its way to Lake Michigan or even the Atlantic Ocean with the watershed that we live in here. And so just making sure that people understand that their everyday activities can have an impact, whether how small or how large, and everything that we do has some type of impact. Goshen is a very giving community, and that was very clear in this event. Anywhere from people giving their time to help fill sandbags and sandbag a neighbor's property, trying to help them save what they could because of the rising floodwaters, all the way down to what was given after the fact through donations, both in goods from food or clothing to now monetary donations through the fund that was established by Mayor Stutzman. It was very clear that everybody had the good of their fellow citizens in mind as that was happening. As part of the recovery effort, there was a number of employees that helped the Goshen Planning Department to do damage assessment reports to kind of figure out what kind of impact the flood had caused. And we had to work the Saturday after the event. And not only were there city employees there, but there was also community members that volunteered their Saturday to help with that and to assess the structures, because we had I believe now we've had over 300 structures that were impacted, but as of that morning, we knew of at least 200. And to do that all with city employees was going to be time consuming, and the fact that we had other people out there that were able to, that were giving of their time so we could look at those areas was very helpful, because unfortunately with a flood event, you have water lines, and as soon as it rains or over time, those water lines disappear, and those are key things that we needed to look for, and so to be able to look at and cover most of those structures that Saturday was very helpful and very important, and was very clear sign of the common good that we have here in Goshen, or the uncommon good, but also then just the response from those that were impacted. Talking with people, most people were very receptive to what needed to be done because the idea was that it would, in the end, hopefully that would help them. Those damage assessment reports help to identify what kind of impact we have and go towards any type of recovery effort that might come, whether it be from local, state, or national agencies. And so that was another sign. I guess the way I see that fitting in is that we as citizens of Goshen and the Elkhart River watershed and the larger community, I mean, that everything that we do has an impact, and so what we do on our own property, our own land, has an impact somewhere else. It may not seem like it at the time, but whatever we do has an impact, and so usually one thing that we say is someone lives downstream of us. No matter where you're at, someone lives downstream, and so our actions impact somebody else, and so I see that as fitting in with that. So our goals through the education that we do and through trying to bring awareness to people is the fact that we do have an impact somewhere else and then just on our own community. What's going on upstream of us has an impact on us, but then also what we do here has an impact on those communities that live downstream. And that's probably the biggest thing is, as a community, we need to make sure that we are aware of that and keeping that in mind as we move forward with whatever projects that we might have or what projects we have and what we are looking to do. So up until the environmental assessment study and this flooding event, we really haven't talked about resiliency very much. I guess at least in that framework, that term, we've thought about it. I would say we have thought about it over time as we deal with and look at stormwater. As I've done some reading and research as to how how precipitation events may be changing in our area and how that could affect us. That type of thinking has come up and I've thought about that, because if our stormwater systems are designed for a certain type of rain event, if those rain events change or the standard that we set everything on changes, our community won't be prepared, or we won't have the resiliency that we need to adjust or change to changing situations. And so I think that's something that's moving forward, that's something that's going to be included in conversations, because if we don't plan for it and things do change, then we're going to have more events where we have problems and where we have to have a recovery effort, and that's something that we want to avoid.